So work habits, like scanning social media websites or gossiping about your boss, can be toxic to your career. But if you manipulate your habits, you can change the bad ones into good ones. Hi, my name is Aaron Guerrero, and I'm a reporter with U.S. News and World Report. To explain how you can transform your work life by implementing new patterns of behavior, I'm joined today by Charles Duhigg, author of the New York Times bestseller, The Power of Habit: Why We Do What We Do in Life and Business. Charles is also a reporter for the New York Times. Charles, thank you for speaking with me today.
No, thanks for having me.
So, Charles, in the book, you write about the habit loop. For our audience, can you please explain what the habit loop is?
Sure. So what we've learned in particular in the last decade is that every habit has three components. There's a cue, which is like a trigger for an automatic behavior to start, and then a routine, which is the behavior itself, and then finally a reward. And that's how your brain learns to remember this pattern for the future. And the reason why this is kind of important, particularly from a neurological perspective, is that for centuries people have talked about habits, right? Everyone from Aristotle to Oprah talks about changing your habits.
Mm-hmm.
And for the most part, they've always focused on the behavior, on the routine. But what we've learned from a series of experiments and kind of these real insights into how our brain works is that it's really the cues and the rewards that shape how a habit functions. If you want to create a new habit, if you want to change a habit, you really have to pay attention to what triggers that behavior, and most importantly, what reward it provides you, because that's going to shape how you change what you actually do.
And that's, how can creating new rewards in your habit loop change your mentality about a job that maybe you dislike or even outright hate?
Well, I think it's not so much new rewards. It's really recognizing the rewards that you crave, right? I mean, if you have a job that you hate, it's probably unlikely that you're going to be able to come up with some new habits that make you love it all of a sudden. But let's say that there's parts of your day that you sort of feel powerless over. Let's say you find yourself going up to the cafeteria and getting a cookie, or you find yourself constantly on Facebook or something like that.
Mm-hmm.
What you really have to figure out is, what reward is that behavior providing to you? Is it that you're actually hungry, and so when you go to the cafeteria, you're really just looking for something to eat? Or is it that you're craving this social experience, which was an issue that I had, and that you go up to the cafeteria and you get something to eat because it's a convenient excuse for seeing your friends and gossiping for 20 minutes? If it's the latter, that it's this reward that you're seeking is really the social experience, there's other ways to get that social experience that don't involve, say, eating a cookie. And as a result, you can change that behavior. But the key is to try and figure out, what is the reward that you're actually craving? Because that's going to point out to you why this neurological habit loop has evolved around this certain behavior.
And if that reward is socializing with a coworker, for maybe you do it for too long of a period, for 25 minutes, and it takes you off task, is a simple fix minimalizing that to maybe 10 minutes, something along those lines?
Well, or trying to figure out, like, what is it about that socialization that you actually crave, right? Most rewards that are most powerful are something that is a release from tension. This is the number one way. The number one thing that our brain craves is to be released from some kind of tension. In fact, the release from tension is so powerful that, for instance, people who bite their nails, nail biting has had a lot of research, and as people have looked at it, what they found is that the reason why people bite their nails is that usually they're feeling this moment of anxiety or of boredom, sort of this tension around anxiety or boredom. And so they'll automatically, without even realizing what they're doing, put their finger up to their mouth and bite their nail. And it causes this brief burst of pain, right? And that brief burst of pain is enough to kind of neurologically overwhelm the tension from boredom or the tension from anxiety. So we don't usually think about pain as a reward. But when the alternative is tension, pain is actually preferable. Your brain will move towards whatever relieves that tension. So your question about, if you're socializing for 25 minutes, you want to make it 10 minutes, what do you do? Well, then the question really is, what is it about that socialization that you're actually craving? Is it just sort of having a conversation and gossiping? Or is it that you use this 25-minute chat to kind of get something off your chest. And it usually takes you 15 minutes to get to whatever's bothering you and sort of get it off your chest and have this moment of sort of cathartic release. Once you figure out what tension you're feeling, what reward is actually driving your behavior, then you can deliver that reward to yourself much more efficiently. If the whole point of talking to a friend is to complain about your boss, once you realize that, you can go up and complain about your boss right away. You don't have to wait 15 minutes and talk about the weather in order to get to that point in the conversation.
Okay. Now, it's interesting, in the book, you talk about professionals from all walks of life, from CEOs of major corporations to managers at a local Starbucks, store managers, to an NFL coach. You know, based on what you observed from their professional lives, what are some universally good work habits that you would recommend to others?
Well, there really aren't universally good work habits, right? If you're an Olympic swimmer like Michael Phelps, who we discuss in the book, versus, for instance, a marketer, you're going to have different habits. What is important is that people who are successful seem to think about their habits, and they seem to think about their habits in kind of deliberate ways. Is there a duck? That's okay. They seem to think about their habits in kind of deliberate ways, right? What they do is they tend to look for habits that seem empowering. Within psychology, this is known as the science of small wins. That what we know is that some habits seem to matter more than others in people's lives. These are usually referred to as keystone habits. And when a keystone habit changes, it tends to set off this chain reaction that makes other patterns also shift. And one thing that's a lot of keystone habits have in common is that they give us a sense of empowerment. They give us a sense of these small, daily, minute victories that create kind of a sense of motivation, of accomplishment. So whether you're Michael Phelps or whether you're a marketer or whether you're, sitting in some office at a .com, what's important is to think about, to diagnose your habits, and then try and find ways that you feel empowered by these daily patterns in your life, because studies indicate that once you feel empowered, once you sort of harness this science of small wins, that you'll be more likely to be able to kind of focus your attention on what you feel like you really want to focus on.
And that has to be encouraging for someone who thinks that changing maybe a toxic work habit that they've struggled with for some time, it can be done in small measures. It doesn't have to be a radically all-at-once kind of approach. You can take those keystone habits that you talk about and do it in a small, manageable way.
Absolutely. And in fact, oftentimes if you just find one habit, once you change that small keystone habit, other changes will kind of almost unlock automatically. Right? Take exercise. For a lot of people, exercise is a keystone habit. We know from studies that when people start exercising, they tend to start eating better. Their eating habits change. And that kind of, without them actually even thinking about it. And that kind of makes sense, right? Because you start running and you feel good about your body, and it's easier to bypass the hamburger for the salad. What's interesting is that according to these studies done by these researchers named Oten and Cheng, when some people start exercising, they also start using their credit cards less. They procrastinate less during the day. They, on average, do their dishes about 27 minutes earlier each day. And the reason why is because for a lot of people, exercise is this keystone habit that once you start exercising, it starts changing your self-concept in a way that it makes it easier for you to save money or to get into work and get stuff done or to take care of tasks that are otherwise kind of unpleasant. This is the lesson for people, is that if you can identify those keystone habits in your life, you can start to change them, and other changes will unfold almost somewhat on their own.
And I want to get a little bit personal with you, because you mentioned your issue with cookies a little bit earlier. And after researching and writing this book, have you refashioned some of your habits to become a more productive worker? And if so, which ones, and what has the effect been in your personal life?
Yeah, I mean, absolutely. I think that my wife and I, and we have 2 kids, we think about their habits a lot, and we think about our own habits a lot. I mean, the key is really to identify these rewards, right? Like I started exercising a lot more as I was writing this book, because I understood that an exercise habit usually forms when you give yourself a reward while after you're exercising. When you think about how most people go running in the morning, they get up and they go for a run, and then they get home and they're late, and so they rush through their shower and they're kind of anxious about making it to work. In other words, they're basically kind of punishing themselves for exercising. But what we know from studies, in particular this one study that was done in Germany, is that if you tell people, okay, go put your shoes next to your bed as a cue, or always go running at the same time of day, or go and work out with the same group of friends, if you tell them to give themselves a cue, but then also when you're done working out, give yourself a small piece of chocolate, a reward that you genuinely enjoy, or let yourself take a nice long shower, or surf the web for 15 minutes. If you tell people to choose a reward that they give themselves, they're much more likely to actually make that behavior into a habit. In fact, they're about 50% more likely. And so this is kind of the philosophy that my wife and I use in our life. You know, I've identified a couple of habits that matter a lot for my productivity. I'm a reporter, right? So one of my big rules is that it's better to make a phone call than it is to read something, because oftentimes you can learn a lot more just by calling someone up and asking them questions and then telling them, I don't know which questions to ask you, so can you just tell me what I should be asking you about? That's more efficient. But that's hard, right? It's hard to pick up the phone. It's hard to call someone. And so what you have to do is you have to focus on the rewards you're going to give yourself for doing it. That if you make it through 5 calls in a day, that you say to yourself, look, that's great. I really accomplished something. Maybe I didn't figure out the answer for what this story should be about, but I'm going to celebrate the fact that I did this thing, because that will encourage your brain to make that pattern into a habit, to make it feel more automatic. And then it gets easier and easier.
And lastly, if someone has made, changing a work habit, it takes willpower, it takes discipline. If someone has been in the workforce for maybe 10 years, and maybe the last 5 years they've struggled with having a bad habit, but they're making a conscious decision to change that toxic habit, what's the time frame? What should they expect before they begin to see a difference in their lives?
It differs from person to person and habit to habit. There's this sort of old wives' tale that takes 21 days to change a habit. Unfortunately, there's no scientific evidence that's true. But what we do know is this: the way that your neurology changes is that certain neurological pathways will essentially get thicker and thicker and thicker the more that they're used. The more that there's a connection between a cue and a routine and a reward, the thicker a neurological pathway will become. And as a result, it's easier for impulses to travel down that pathway. And so on day 3, it's going to be a little bit easier than it was on day 1. On day 21, it's going to be easier than it was on day 3. At some point, it's going to kind of tip over. And instead of being something that takes willpower, it's just going to feel automatic. You probably won't even realize at the time that you've tipped over into this place where it suddenly feels like you can do this without having to think about it very hard. But that's what will happen. And so the good news is that it's worth doing, because every day it's going to get easier, and at some point it becomes a habit.
Well, Charles, I would encourage all of our listeners today to read the book, but I would especially encourage those who feel as if one habit or even 2 is stalling their career. And Charles, once again, I want to thank you for taking time out of your very busy schedule to speak with me today.
Thanks for having me.